This story centers around a high school student in South Korea who narrates the story of his classmate, a genius student who always ranks first. Despite being exceptionally intelligent, this student has a cold attitude and almost never shows any expression, even when he wins a national mathematics competition. Unlike Yusong High School, which is known for its chaos, Seon School is relatively calm and normal. However, there are still some mischievous students who often bully their peers. One of them is Young Bin, the child of a super-rich family, who is always accompanied by two loyal followers in class. One day, Young Bin becomes irritated by Seon's indifferent attitude and disregard for him. Frustrated, he throws a shoe at Seon. However, Seon merely responds with his usual blank expression without any reaction. This makes Young Bin feel disrespected and angry. He approaches Seon with a sharp gaze, trying to intimidate him.
네 생각은 어때? 뒤질래?
At the same time, some students from another class enter the room to look for a student named An Suho. Suho is known as a student who often sleeps in class and seems uninterested in lessons. However, behind his lazy attitude, Suho possesses great martial arts skills. He almost entered the UFC fighting arena and is quite feared by Young Bin's group. This is evident when he easily defeats one student after another who tries to attack him. Despite this, there is something interesting about Suho. For some reason, he seems to be wary of Seon. This is apparent when he accidentally drops Seon's stationery. Without saying much, Suho immediately picks it up and apologizes.
미안하다.
After school, Seon continues to maintain his blank expression, even when greeting his father at home. He lives alone with his father after his parents' divorce. Since then, happiness seems to have disappeared from his home life. Seon prefers to spend his time studying every day. Not only is Seon smart, but he is also known as the student who always arrives the earliest at school to study. This is in contrast to Suho, who often appears lazy by almost always sleeping in class. One day, Seon is once again bullied by Young Bin's gang. They take his gym uniform out of his bag.
왜? 뭐가 없어졌어?
확 바로 저어버리래.
Despite his academic intelligence, Seon is physically weak. He always struggles to keep up with physical education lessons, which often becomes the subject of mockery by Young Bin's followers. However, this time Suho is the only one who defends Seon. He does not like the way the gang is treating Seon and decides to stop them. After the physical education class ends, Seon innocently approaches Young Bin's gang and asks them to stop bothering him. Unfortunately, this request only angers Young Bin. He feels that Seon's plea was rude. As a result, Seon is attacked by the group. Luckily, a teacher arrives just in time to break up the commotion. From this incident, it is clear that Seon is just an ordinary student who wants to study peacefully without being disturbed. However, there are always troublesome students looking for trouble with him, forcing Seon to fight back in order to avoid being trampled on. The next day, Seon and his friends are introduced to a new student named Bom Seok who transferred from another school. He is the child of a council member. From his appearance, Bom Seok seems like a shy student with low self-confidence, making it easy to predict that he will become Young Bin's next target for bullying. On the same day, there is another confrontation between Seon and Young Bin. Young Bin carelessly sits in Seon's seat, which Seon sees as an impolite act. The tension almost turns into a fight, but An Suho steps in to break it up. It's important to note that Suho is an MMA athlete, so many students at the school, including Young Bin, respect him and are afraid to contradict him. Unlike Seon and other students who attend extra classes after school, Young Bin prefers to hang out at a cafe with his gang while drinking. Even worse, they are already familiar with illegal drugs obtained from a dealer named Shinjo, who turns out to be Young Bin's cousin. Meanwhile, after Seon finishes his extra lessons, he is suddenly confronted by two of Shinjo's henchmen who mistakenly thinks Si Eun is a buyer of their illicit goods. The situation becomes tense as Si Eun grips a pen with a sharp look, ready to fight back if they make a move. Fortunately, Shinjo appears and orders his men to step back, warning them not to accuse people without cause.
저 새끼 너 찍으려고 그랬잖아.
The next day, Si Eun and his friends are practicing questions in preparation for exams. However, Young Bin, still harboring resentment, causes trouble again. This time he orders Bom Seok to attach a substance called fentanyl to Si Eun's neck. Bom Seok doesn't want to do it, but he is threatened with being bullied, just like he was at his previous school if he refuses. To protect himself, he reluctantly follows Young Bin's orders. Fentanyl is a powerful anesthetic that can cause dizziness, nausea, and even loss of consciousness. As soon as the drug touched his skin, Si Eun immediately felt dizzy. However, despite his weak body, Si Eun struggled to fight off the effects of the drug. He even slapped his own cheek to stay conscious during the exam. His actions shocked his classmates, who thought Si Eun might be possessed. After the exam ended, Si Eun felt frustrated as he realized that there was one question he had answered incorrectly. When his patience finally ran out, he exploded with emotion. However, even in his anger, Si Eun didn't act recklessly. He still used logic and calculation, even applying the principle of centrifugal force to control the situation efficiently. At that moment, the brutal side of this quiet student was revealed. Si Eun truly beat up Young Bin and his followers, telling them that he had tried to solve the problem in a peaceful manner before. He even expressed a desire to take things further. Luckily, An Suho arrived and tried to stop him, but Si Eun seemed almost possessed and difficult to control until a female teacher came and halted the chaos.
뭐냐? 너?
As a result of the incident, Young Bin had to be taken to the hospital because of a broken nose. Si Eun, accompanied by his teacher, also visited to apologize. However, when they arrived at the hospital, Young Bin's mother immediately scolded Si Eun for his actions. Si Eun didn't argue, but then he presented evidence in the form of fentanyl that Young Bin had used on him. He also brought Young Bin's bag, which contained drugs. This made the situation far more serious. It was no longer just teenage mischief, but had entered the realm of criminal activity that couldn't be solved at school. The next day, while Si Eun was focusing on his work in class, two of Young Bin's henchmen tried to intimidate him. They wanted to get back at him for what he had done to Young Bin the day before, but Si Eun challenged them to settle the matter in the school toilet. Unbeknownst to them, Si Eun was actually using psychological tactics. He applied the Pavlov experiment principle, using a pen as a stimulus that triggered their trauma from the previous incident. As a result, he managed to take control of the situation without needing to engage in physical combat.
부탁이다.
Meanwhile, at the hospital, Young Bin, still holding a grudge for being beaten by Si Eun, finally asked for help from his cousin Shinjo. Initially, Shinjo warned Young Bin not to stir up trouble recklessly. However, because of their family bond, Shinjo felt compelled to intervene and take revenge on Si Eun. On the other hand, Si Eun's relationship with An Suho began to change. One day, after finishing his extra lessons, Si Eun accidentally ran into Suho, who was working part-time as a food delivery person. This meeting became the starting point of their closeness. For the first time, Si Eun, who was usually cold and indifferent, started to open up. He even treated Suho to a meal at the school canteen as an apology for the outburst that had occurred a while ago. It turned out that the reason An Suho always slept at school was because he worked from night to morning. He feared that if he went home, he wouldn't wake up on time for school. Therefore, Suho chose to sleep at school, even using the staff facilities to shower. His habit caught Bom Seok's attention, the new student who also wanted to be friends with Si Eun and Suho. He saw that even though Si Eun was quiet, he dared to stand up to anyone who troubled him. Bom Seok tried to get closer by saying he wanted to join Si Eun's extra lessons. Whether his intention was genuinely to make friends or just to seek protection from the bullies, Si Eun remained indifferent and didn't pay much attention. Meanwhile, a student who was addicted to online gambling had staked all of his savings but suffered a huge loss. With no money left, he decided to borrow from Shinjo. It turns out that in addition to being a drug dealer, Shinjo also ran an illegal lending practice with high interest rates for students who had fallen into gambling.
언제쯤 가?
Long story short, after school, young Bin, who had teamed up with Shinjo, waited for Seun to exact revenge. When Seun arrived, he was immediately taken to Shinjo's hideout. There, they intended to eliminate him in retaliation for his actions against Young Bin. Bom Seok, seeing Seun being dragged away, felt guilty because he was the one who had applied fentanyl to Seun's neck. Worried about Seun's safety, he sought help from Suho. At first, Suho refused, thinking they weren't close enough to get involved in such a problem. However, after Bom Seok offered him money in exchange, Suho's attitude changed, and he agreed to help. Meanwhile, Seun, in a cornered position, remained calm. He used his intelligence to analyze the situation and look for opportunities. By using the items around him, he began to strike quickly and precisely, leaving Shinjo and his group shocked. Unfortunately, due to the overwhelming number of opponents, Seun was eventually defeated and beaten up.
법으로 봐서.
When Young Bin attempted to harm Seun's hand, Suho arrived just in time. As a former MMA athlete, Suho quickly fought off Shinjo's group. Despite his smaller size, he was able to handle them thanks to his solid self-defense skills. During the fight, Young Bin tried to seize the opportunity to attack Seun with a glass bottle. Suho, still occupied with fighting Shinjo, couldn't save him in time. That's when Bom Seok, who had always appeared to be timid, boldly stepped in and saved Seun. His action indirectly ended the chaos. Seeing Bom Seok's bravery, Shinjo realized he had crossed a line by involving himself in schoolchildren's affairs. Feeling embarrassed, he decided to leave the scene. From this incident, the relationship between Seun, Suho, and Bom Seok began to change. The three of them grew closer and celebrated the beginning of their friendship by having a meal together at Suho's part-time job.
우리 진짜 연습 맛있다.
Meanwhile, misfortune struck Shinjo and his group. Because they were distracted with their personal matters, the work they were supposed to finish was left incomplete. As a result, they had to face their boss in the illegal gambling business, named Gil-soo. Without saying much, Gil-soo beat up Shinjo and even injured his hand. Unfortunately, Young Bin hadn't realized that his cousin's involvement had dragged them into a much bigger problem than just a school fight. Meanwhile, after hanging out with Suho and Bom Seok, Seun accidentally encountered a woman stealing lipstick. The woman, Yonggi, was one of Shinjo's associates. Yonggi had a unique personality, too familiar, flirtatious, and overly friendly. She immediately grabbed Seun's arm and invited him to eat with her in the pouring rain. Without hesitation, she asked Seun to save her contact number.
내 스타일인 것 같아서. 저는 미안. 알았어, 빨리 갈게.
The next day, Young Bin, now the subject of ridicule at school, suddenly begged Seun to testify that the fentanyl found earlier wasn't his. If not, he could end up in prison. At first, Seun didn't care, considering Young Bin was the one who started everything. However, after thinking about the serious consequences, Seun agreed to accompany him to meet his mother's lawyer. But instead of meeting the lawyer, Young Bin trapped Seun and took him to Gil-soo's hideout. It was there that it was revealed that Gil-soo had beaten Shinjo the day before to get a medical certificate. He planned to accuse Seun as the culprit in order to sue him for 15 million won, even though it was actually Gil-soo who had provoked the whole thing. Not stopping there, Gil-soo's men began terrorizing Seun and his friends daily to make sure they paid the money. They even followed them home. Bom Seok, who came from a wealthy family, desperately stole his father's expensive watch and sold it to raise the money. Meanwhile, Seun decided to meet Yonggi to gather information about Gil-soo. From their conversation, Seun learned that Gil-soo forced teens like Shinjo and his friends to become drug dealers. They were initially trapped by loans and were then slowly coerced into other illegal activities. In other words, anyone caught by Gil-soo wouldn't be able to escape easily. The only way to fight back was to report him to the police, but they needed strong evidence such as documents and files from Gil-soo's hideout. To obtain this evidence, An Soo-ho took a risky step and offered himself as bait. He planned to infiltrate Gil-soo's hideout and send Seon the location so they could bring the police in afterward. When An Soo-ho successfully got in, he immediately shared the location. However, things didn't go as planned. Gil-soo, suspicious from the start, immediately beat up An Soo-ho before anything could happen. Realizing that the police were on their way, he quickly ordered his men to clean up and move all the evidence.
니네 다 따라와.
Meanwhile, Bomsok, who arrived at the location first and wanted to hand over the 15 million won to free Soo-ho, was also kidnapped and taken to a new hideout. Soon after, Seon arrived at Gil-soo's hideout with 2 police officers. However, they seemed uninterested in handling the case seriously and appeared lazy, especially when they learned that An Soo-ho and Bomseok had already been moved and there was no evidence left. In other words, their visit was futile. Back at Gil-soo's hideout, on the way to the new hideout, he started to realize that Yonggi had betrayed him. Without hesitation, he ordered Shinjo to capture and bring her back. Realizing her life was in danger, Yonggi quickly sent a message to Si Eun asking for help. She included the location of their hideout and requested Si Eun to come with the police, believing that An Soo-ho and Bomseok were also being held there. The location turned out to be an old abandoned amusement park. There, Gil-soo, who had been waiting, immediately vented his anger on Shinjo. He brutally beat him, believing Shinjo had failed in his duties and was incapable of managing his subordinates. Gil-soo didn't stop there. He coldly ordered a 14-year-old boy to kill An Soo-ho and Bomseok, exploiting the legal loopholes that protected minors from jail time. At this point, Shinjo, who had been suppressing his disgust, finally rebelled. He challenged Gil-soo to a one-on-one duel. Although physically weaker, Gil-soo always carried a knife, making the fight uneven. Shinjo, fighting barehanded, was eventually overwhelmed and defeated. However, when the situation became more dire, Yonggi suddenly appeared from behind and struck Gil-soo in the head with a wooden stick. The attack caused Gil-soo to stumble briefly. Unfortunately, Gil-soo quickly recovered and retaliated brutally. Just then, the sound of police sirens interrupted the chaos, distracting Gil-soo. Soon after, Seon arrived at the scene and immediately helped free An Soo-ho and Bomseok. However, the sirens weren't from actual police cars. They were just a recording from Seon's phone, intentionally played as a diversion. Realizing he'd been tricked, Gil-soo returned with his men, and a fierce fight broke out between them and Si Eun's group. Fortunately, Si Eun's strategy worked. Not long after, real police officers arrived because they had received a prior report. However, since only one officer had come, Gil-soo managed to use the chaos to escape. Seeing this, Si Eun immediately gave chase. The final battle began. Si Eun, lacking fighting skills, struggled against Gil-soo. Fortunately, An Soo-ho arrived just in time to help. With their combined efforts, they eventually subdued Gil-soo. Meanwhile, Shinjo decided to surrender to the police. He asked that Yonggi, whom he considered like a sister, not be involved in the matter. Shinjo was then taken to the police station for questioning about his involvement in Gil-soo's illegal business. Upon arriving at the police station, Si Eun and Bomseok were officially released. This was thanks to Bomseok's father, a powerful official, who sent his aide to handle everything. To protect his family's image, the aide lobbied the police to drop all cases involving Bomseok. Not only that, the aide even brought Gil-soo to the police chief's office and beat him up as retaliation. He also asked Bomseok to do the same. However, Seok, traumatized and not used to violence, refused and quietly left the room. Before leaving, there was a moment when Shinjo sincerely expressed his respect and gratitude to Seun for freeing him and the others from Gil-soo's control. Outside, Seun met Yonggi, who was waiting for Shinjo as she no longer had a place to stay. Seun decided to take her to the hospital where An Suho was being treated. After leaving the hospital, Seun returned to his own home. However, after all the time spent with others, the house now felt very empty. For the first time, Seun showed signs of change. He began taking initiative, bringing food to the hospital, and visiting with a face that could finally smile, a significant development in his character. On the other hand, Seok's misfortune didn't end at school. It turned out his suffering extended beyond that. His authoritarian and cruel father disciplined him with violence, beating him as punishment for stealing the watch and causing trouble. The next day, Seok came to school. Despite his weakened state, he tried to act as usual, pretending everything was fine. Ironically, he became popular after disrupting the gangsters' operation and helping send Gil-soo to prison, and Suho and the others planned to celebrate by having lunch together in the cafeteria after school.
이게 다 들어가?
시간 되지. 내가 맞으면 또 못 참지.
However, before heading to the cafeteria, Seok browsed on Suho's social media and saw photos of him spending time with Yonggi. This made him feel unappreciated. He felt sidelined and used. His feelings worsened when he saw the growing closeness between Suho and Yonggi. He felt replaced and regarded as nothing more than a cash machine. Bad memories from his old school began to haunt him. He remembered how his old friends had used him the same way, paying for him once, then twice, and eventually making it a habit. When he couldn't keep up, they would get angry and distance themselves. The trauma intensified when he unexpectedly encountered an old classmate who used to bully him. In that moment, Seok snapped and yelled at Yonggi for answering a phone call on his behalf without permission, which led his old classmates to learn where he was. Fortunately, Seun was quick to respond and immediately urged them to leave. Since the incident, Seok had changed drastically. From a weak and shy student, he had become arrogant and easily angered. This was evident when he yelled at his classmates just for making noise. Even An Suho, who tried to calm him down, became the target of his anger. However, up until this point, Seok still hadn't revealed what had truly happened. His change in behavior left An Suho and Seun confused, unaware that Seok's past trauma had developed into depression. This was further compounded when his old friends began reaching out to him again, inviting him to meet up. Unable to handle the pressure, Seok chose to turn off his phone for a while to clear his mind. The next day, An Suho was seen teaching Seun some basic martial arts moves under a bridge.
막 너를 막 패 죽여버리겠대. 가만 안.
However, their concern over Seok, who hadn't shown up for school, prompted them to visit him at his house. Upon arriving, An Suho was surprised by the grandeur of Seok's house, a far cry from the image of a typical student. It was at this moment that Seok finally opened up about the secret he had been keeping all along. He revealed that he wasn't the biological child of his father, but an adopted child, taken in solely to protect his father's public image as a government official. He also shared the dark story of his past at his old school, how he had been severely bullied to the point of hospitalization and eventually had to transfer schools. Upon hearing this, Seun could understand Seok's pain, but An Suho, known for his strict nature, became emotionally triggered. He immediately suggested they confront the bullies and promised that they would make them apologize. At the usual hangout spot, Seok stood up and demanded that the bullies kneel and apologize for what they had done to him. Naturally, they initially refused and belittled him, and Suho stepped in, threatening them to apologize. But when their apology came out mockingly, Seok couldn't hold back his emotions. He almost struck one of them with a microphone, but An Suho stopped him just in time. Realizing that Seok had crossed the line, An Suho pulled him away from the situation. However, Seok's reaction was quite the opposite. He accused An Suho of never truly valuing him, treating him as nothing more than a subordinate, just like his old friends had. This statement angered An Soo-ho, but before things escalated further, Seon quickly intervened and separated them. Not long after, while Bom-seok was walking alone, he was once again followed by his old bullies who were out for revenge. Fortunately, Young-bin's group arrived just in time and took the bullies to a secluded spot to beat them up. Though Bom-seok wasn't close to them, the school had an unwritten rule. Anyone who disturbed their students would have to face the entire group. For the first time, Bom-seok felt protected. He joined in beating up one of the bullies who had tormented him, and in that moment, he truly changed. He began to lose control, becoming brutal, and seemed to discover a new world, a world where he felt valued and had a place.
끝났냐? 한잔하러 가자.
From that point on, Bom-seok joined Young-bin's group and even started going with them to nightclubs. It wasn't just about feeling accepted. He also felt that this group supported him more than An Soo-ho, who he felt had been controlling and belittling him by saying that Bom-seok wasn't competent. Bom-seok's transformation didn't stop there. From the quiet and shy kid he once was, he began drinking alcohol to appear like a rebellious teenager. At his emotional peak, he even unfollowed An Soo-ho's social media accounts, signaling the end of their friendship. The next day, Bom-seok showed up to school in a state far from his usual self. The effects of the alcohol were still evident in his demeanor, speech, and overall behavior, but instead of hiding it, Bom-seok openly flaunted his closeness with Young-bin's group in front of Si-eun. Seeing this drastic change, Si-eun couldn't remain silent. He immediately confronted Bom-seok, asking what had really happened. Without hesitation, Bom-seok poured out his feelings, explaining that it all stemmed from his hurt toward An Soo-ho. He felt like he had never been seen as a true friend. To him, An Soo-ho was too focused on himself, always thinking he was the strongest and the most correct, treating others, including Bom-seok, as nothing more than accessories. Unbeknownst to Bom-seok, An Soo-ho overheard everything from behind. His face was filled with deep disappointment. He hadn't realized that the person he had considered a close friend had such deep-seated resentment toward him. From that moment on, their relationship began to unravel. Bom-seok chose to distance himself, spending more time at nightclubs with his new group. There, he unexpectedly ran into Young-bin, who had transferred schools. During their meeting, Young-bin introduced his new friend, an MMA fighter named Poncho, who had once been in the same ring as An Soo-ho. Meanwhile, Si-eun, who was with An Soo-ho, began to worry that Bom-seok was being used by Young-bin's group, but An Soo-ho reacted much colder. He calmly remarked that perhaps Bom-seok had always been riding on their fame and that now, after gaining enough confidence, he had moved to an environment where he felt stronger. The situation escalated during lunch break. Young-bin's followers, including Bom-seok, cut in line with arrogance. Having been patient for so long, An Soo-ho finally took action. Not only did he scold them, but he also gave them a lesson. Instead of understanding, Bom-seok responded as if it were a challenge to a duel, since they had once been close. An Soo-ho, running out of patience, accepted the challenge, and that moment marked the official end of their friendship. From that point on, Bom-seok's hatred toward An Soo-ho grew deeper. He began looking for ways to get back at him, and one name came to his mind: Poncho. Poncho was a fighter from a different gym, and he held a long-standing grudge for having lost to An Soo-ho in the ring. So when Bom-seok offered him a large sum of money to defeat An Soo-ho on his birthday, Poncho agreed without hesitation. For Poncho, this wasn't just a fight, it was an opportunity for revenge and to prove that he was now stronger than anyone, even An Soo-ho. To ensure Poncho's victory, Bom-seok and his group took a cruel step. One night, while An Soo-ho was delivering food, they, Bom-seok, Young-bin, and two of his henchmen, secretly cut the brake line on An Soo-ho's motorcycle. Their plan worked. During his ride, An Soo-ho's brakes failed, causing him to crash and almost get hit by a car. Thankfully, he survived. The next day at school, from the look in Bom-seok's eyes, An Soo-ho could already guess who was behind the incident, but he chose to hold back, trying to stay positive. Without proof, he didn't want to make accusations, though his heart was filled with doubt. An Suho's birthday arrived. Seon and Yonggi were busy decorating a room to celebrate simply but warmly. However, behind the happy atmosphere, Bom Seok's malicious plan continued. Since An Suho hadn't responded to his messages, Bom Seok contacted Yonggi and asked to meet in a specific place. Yonggi, unaware of the situation, calmly went to meet him, unaware she was walking into a trap. When Yonggi's phone went silent and she didn't show up, Seon and An Suho began to worry. Amid their growing panic, Seon accidentally saw a message notification from Bom Seok on An Suho's phone. While An Suho was busy cooking, Seon bravely opened the message. It was clear. Bom Seok was instructing An Suho to come if he wanted Yonggi to be safe. Realizing the danger, Seon made a big decision. He replied to the message without telling An Suho, then deleted it to erase the trace. He then left, telling An Suho he was going to follow Yonggi. But in reality, Seon was heading to the place Bom Seok had mentioned with full preparation and determination. Armed with a wrench as an emergency weapon, Seon infiltrated the building where Yonggi was held. He had studied the building's layout beforehand. Once he found Yonggi, he immediately freed her. But of course it wasn't that easy. Since he was with a girl, Seon had to protect her while fighting against Yongbin and his men. Using narrow hallways and nearby objects as weapons, Seon tried to hold his ground. Yonggi took the opportunity to flee and call for help from the police. However, the situation took a drastic turn when Poncho appeared. The experienced MMA fighter quickly demonstrated his superior skill. He could read every one of Seon's movements effortlessly. It didn't take long before Seon collapsed, unable to handle such a formidable opponent. And in his weakened state, Yongbin and his henchmen began to beat him mercilessly as a form of release and revenge. In the chaos, Bom Seok, who initially only wanted to teach An Suho a lesson, began to realize his mistake. He never intended to hurt Seon, the only person who had always considered him a friend and tried to understand his feelings. But by then, it was too late. Fortunately, just as things were getting worse, the police arrived on time thanks to Yonggi's bravery. Yongbin's group was disbanded. However, the damage that had been done, both physically and emotionally, could not be undone. Long story short, after the turmoil, Seon was found in critical condition. He was rushed to the hospital in an ambulance with serious injuries. Before leaving, the police asked him who the assailants were. With a weak voice, Seon lied and said there was no assault, that he had simply fallen. It was a lie he intentionally told. He didn't want anyone, especially An Suho, to know what had really happened. Seon hoped that everything would end here. Seon also asked Yonggi to keep the incident a secret and not tell An Suho what had actually happened. He was worried that if An Suho found out who had attacked him, An Suho would seek revenge and the violence would escalate. As a final step, Seon called Bom Seok and pleaded with him to stop causing trouble for An Suho before it was too late. On the other hand, An Suho began to feel anxious. Seon and Yonggi hadn't returned, and the next day Seon, who usually attended school, suddenly didn't show up, citing a family emergency. Concerned, An Suho immediately started investigating, asking Yonggi what had really happened. However, Yonggi was reluctant to tell him. She had promised Seon to keep the incident a secret. An Suho became more confused. He even went to Seon's house to check on his friend, but found no trace of him. At the same time, Bom Seok's situation worsened. His father, fed up with his son's behavior, began to beat him mercilessly. Due to his actions, Bom Seok had to ask for police help to cover up the incident and prevent it from spreading, but his father was still not satisfied. This time, he decided to keep a closer eye on Bom Seok and even planned to send him to school abroad to protect his reputation as a council member. The following day, An Suho, still curious about the events from the previous night, began to investigate further. He asked Yongbin's gang if anyone knew who might have damaged his motorcycle some time ago. One of them accidentally slipped up and revealed that they knew about the incident. They were eventually forced to confess. They said that Bom Seok had paid an MA athlete to take down An Suho with the intention of kidnapping Yonggi to lure An Suho into a trap. However, what they had hoped for didn't go as planned. It wasn't An Suho who showed up, but Seon. And what happened next was inevitable violence. Hearing this, An Suho became even more furious. He couldn't just stand by. His desire for revenge against Bom-seok grew stronger, and now he didn't just want to get back at him, but also put an end to all the harm Bom-seok had caused. After everything that happened, An Soo-ho still tried to hide his anger in front of Yeon-gi, even though the rage was burning inside him. He even visited Si-eun, who was still recovering from his injuries, to make sure he was okay. However, despite Si-eun not being at fault in the situation, An Soo-ho felt there was no choice but to seek vengeance, even though he knew it would come with great risks. First, An Soo-ho went to see Yong-bin with the intent to break his arm, just as he had done to Si-eun. However, when he approached Yong-bin, his phone suddenly rang. It was a call from Bom-seok, directing him to a specific location to exact his revenge. What An Soo-ho didn't know was that Bom-seok had already contacted Poncho, an MMA fighter, to face An Soo-ho. An Soo-ho finally arrived at the designated place. To honor Si-eun, he began the meeting by apologizing, admitting if he had said or done anything disappointing. He even asked Bom-seok to apologize to Si-eun for all his actions, but instead of responding well, Bom-seok rejected the apology and challenged An Soo-ho. This time it wasn't Bom-seok who would fight, but Poncho. At that moment, An Soo-ho realized that Bom-seok had been looking for trouble from the start, and it had to be settled through a fight. Without hesitation, An Soo-ho prepared himself by taking on Yong-bin's group as a warm-up. For context, An Soo-ho and Poncho had met before in the ring, where An Soo-ho had won decisively, causing Poncho to record the fight as a form of revenge. At first, An Soo-ho was able to keep up with Poncho's resistance. Even though he rarely trained, he had natural talent and great fighting skills, so he almost managed to defeat Poncho. However, Poncho started exploiting An Soo-ho's weakness, targeting his leg, which had been injured in the previous accident. In the chaos of the fight, one of Yong-bin's henchmen played dirty by pulling on An Soo-ho's leg, weakening him even further. Finally, Poncho landed a decisive blow to An Soo-ho's head, and quickly Yong-bin's group surrounded him to vent their anger. That was when the surprise occurred. Bom-seok's father's aide suddenly appeared and approached them. It turned out that Bom-seok had previously run away from home, and his aide had come to pick him up. However, the situation escalated when they found An Soo-ho lying unconscious and barely breathing. The atmosphere became tense, and Bom-seok's aide asked two of Yong-bin's followers to act as witnesses. He promised to handle the situation by falsifying the incident to make it seem as though An Soo-ho had suffered an accident while exercising. It was then that Bom-seok realized how far he had gone. What he had done had crossed the line, and he felt like a coward who hadn't only destroyed himself, but had also sacrificed the friend he once considered close. Regret came too late, and although he knew his father's punishment would be severe, it still couldn't compare to the guilt he felt for what he had done to his friends. On the other hand, Yeon-gi and Si Eun were worried about An Soo-ho, who hadn't shown up at work for the entire day. They decided to check the building where Yeon-gi had been previously held hostage. However, when they arrived there, they found nothing. The situation only added to their anxiety and made them suspect that An Soo-ho's disappearance was connected to Bom-seok. The next day, Si Eun became even more anxious when An Soo-ho didn't show up at school, especially since it was the day of the semester exams. This made it hard for him to focus during the test. After the exam was over, Yeon-gi called to inform him that An Soo-ho had been found in the hospital, critically injured but still alive. Hearing this news, Si Eun was devastated. Seeing his friend lying unconscious, Si Eun decided to take revenge for the cruel treatment An Soo-ho had endured. Si Eun first went to Yong-bin's new school, where he didn't hesitate to beat up Yong-bin, who was too scared to stop him. During the fight, Yong-bin tried to avoid it by showing the video of An Soo-ho's fight with Poncho and revealing that Bom-seok was behind everything. Si Eun just wanted to make sure that this all ended here. Afterwards, Si Eun immediately went after Poncho, who had fought An Soo-ho earlier. Before Poncho could even react, Si Eun launched the first attack. Although Poncho easily dealt with the attack, Si Eun kept going. Despite being outmatched in fighting skills, Si Eun's determination and anger from seeing his friend hurt kept him from backing down. Seeing Si Eun's strength and persistence, Poncho began to feel a deep fear, eventually begging him to stop the assault. Seun responded by destroying Poncho's ankle, ending his dream of becoming an athlete and completing his revenge. Meanwhile, Bomseok was being driven to school by his father, who intended to meet with the teachers to say goodbye because of Bomseok's transfer abroad. However, on the way, they were stopped by Yonggi, who vented her emotions at Bomseok for what he had done to Eun Suho. At that moment, Bomseok blamed Yonggi for everything, claiming that since her arrival, his friendship with Eun Suho and Seun had been ruined. Back with Seun after dealing with Yongbin and Poncho, he returned to school amidst the ongoing exams, but this time he wasn't there to take the exam. He was there to continue his revenge on those who had harmed Eun Suho. Armed with a fire extinguisher as a weapon, Seun made his way to Bomseok's location. When Seun arrived in front of Bomseok, he still couldn't believe that his friend would go so far as to do something like this. With intense control over his emotions, Seun told Bomseok that he had already pleaded with him to stop his actions, but Bomseok had ignored him. Finally, Seun let his emotions loose, smashing the school window before walking away. The next day, Bomseok had to leave for overseas schooling at his father's request. Initially, Bomseok's father had planned to imprison Seun for his actions, but after seeing the video of Bomseok's cruelty toward Eun Suho, he changed his mind. Bomseok was fortunate that Seun was willing to keep the video private, and the issue was considered resolved. A few days later, Seun was seen being dropped off at his new school by his parents. This was the only school that had accepted him after all other schools rejected him due to Bomseok's father's influence. Unfortunately, his new school turned out to be filled with troublemakers and outcasts who cared nothing for academics. On his first day, Seun was immediately bullied by his classmates, who had no idea who he really was. Meanwhile, a mysterious figure with tattoos on his arm was seen discussing the new student, who was none other than Seun. From their conversation, it seemed that this person was interested in Seun after hearing about how he had defeated Poncho, the MMA fighter.